It takes millions, tens of millions, and way too often hundreds of millions of dollars and between 1 to 2.5 years to make a Hollywood movie from start to finish. But that's only for the lucky few who are able to make it to the finish line. For each movie that makes it to the finish line, there are as many that get cancelled or worse, stuck. The ones that get stuck are in what people call development hell, or movies that get announced but nary a peep is ever heard from them as time goes on. In the most extreme cases, movies get stuck in production hell, meaning that the money is committed and work on the movie has started, but it's never able to make it to post-production or to distribution, so all that money goes to waste. There are a happy few cases where a movie is able to, at long last, get made, like Deadpool, but there are also cases in which some rich real estate tycoon has pumped over $100 million into a movie about mermaids fighting demon mages, which, despite being in development for 2 decades, being fully shot, and even having a trailer cut, is yet to be released. In this video, I want to take a look at 2 kinds of movies. The first are the movies that basically get stuck at the development stage or in development hell. The movies that get announced and maybe begin pre-production, but then they basically fizzle out. The second are the movies that make it to production and have some real money put into them, but have never made it to the theater. They get actors, writers, sets, crew, everything except a finished product. This, for our purposes, is production hell, though obviously the name can also imply a troubleshoot, as is the case for Apocalypse Now. Development hell is probably the most depressing place to stop. Basically, a movie was started and announced, and maybe some hiring decisions even got made, like who would direct, who would be cast, and similar, but then, for whatever reason, often either creative differences or the money not being right, nothing actually happens. No movement, no progress, nothing. It's depressing because there's always some hope that the project will see the light of day, but then weeks turn into months and months turn into years, and nothing is heard. Some lucky few make it out of development hell, but it's often after years, if not decades, of waiting for the right time. The live-action adaptation of Akira is not one of those lucky few, at least not yet. Warner Bros. Has held the rights to Akira for decades, before which it was held by Sony. Akira got started with Katsuhiro Otomo's critically acclaimed manga series, which ran from 1982 until 1990, and was one of the first manga that got popular in the US. If that wasn't enough, it then got adapted into a critically acclaimed and commercially successful animated film, 1988's Akira. Considered one of the greatest movies ever made, it's also had an indelible impact on cyberpunk as a genre, coming out 6 years after Ridley Scott's Blade Runner. The issue with the development are the same as the issues and criticisms that were levied against the Ghost in the Shell movie starring Scarlett Johansson that was released in 2017, and also the ones that the studio wishes to avoid lest the movie, like Ghost in the Shell, turn out to be a financial boondoggle. The first criticism and apprehension was to do with casting, who would play the parts. When Scarlett Johansson was announced to be playing the lead in Ghost in the Shell, it caused a bit of stir in the press and was thought of as whitewashing. The second criticism is the far more common issue when it comes to adaptations, namely failing to adhere to the source material, or as J.R.R. Tolkien put it, quote, "The canons of narrative in any medium cannot be wholly different, and the failure of poor films is often precisely in exaggeration, and in the intrusion of unwarranted matter owing to not perceiving where the core of the original lies," end quote. Basically, adaptations fail to capture the spirit of the original by changing things that need no changing. One of the versions of the live-action Akira, to be directed by Stephen Norrington, did just this. In an interview with The Hollywood Reporter, Norrington mentioned Americanizing the story, saying, quote, "It preserves the tone, the visual, and the epic scope of the original, whilst telling a somewhat more accessible story," end quote, for Western audiences. After Norrington dropped out of the project, Leonardo DiCaprio came on as a producer, and it was decided to move the story out of Japan and into the US, specifically Manhattan. It was to be directed by Rewari Robinson, and they had some concept art drawn. He wasn't the last one to leave either. Numerous other directors and writers have been attached to Akira over the years, and they all have varying visions. The budget has ranged from 60 to 90 million, and actors looked at for the role of Kaneda have included Keanu Reeves, Joaquin Phoenix, Chris Evans, Chris Pine, James Franco, Justin Timberlake, and more, while directors looked at have included George Miller, Justin Lin, and Christopher Nolan. Most recently, it was Taika Waititi to direct and Michael Golamko to write the script. The movie was due in 2021, but Waititi left to do Thor: Love and Thunder. He's attached to the project again, but whether it'll actually get made is anyone's guess. Whether it'll be made well is an even bigger question mark. While Akira has shuffled through numerous directors, writers, and the like, At the Mountains of Madness has had one person trying to get it made for more than 30 years at this point, Guillermo del Toro. He and screenwriter Matthew Robin came up with the script in the mid-2000s but have found it difficult to get financing for the movie, which is based on a novella by H.P. Lovecraft. Now, if anyone's read any of H.P. Lovecraft and watched any of Del Toro's movies, they know that this should be a match made in heaven, and a pretty simple decision. Warner Brothers, the studio Del Toro asked to finance the movie, had reservations from the beginning though. According to Del Toro, they were, quote, very nervous about the cost and it not having a love story or a happy ending, but it's impossible to do either in the Lovecraft universe, end quote. The difficulty in going from idea to screen is something that Del Toro is used to by now. He's a guy that's always bursting with ideas, and he's had several projects get stuck in development hell, though some of them, like Pinocchio, do find their way to screen. But others, like his Jabba the Hutt movie, his two-part The Hobbit movie, and adaptation of Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-5, either get put on the back burner or get shelved entirely. At the Mountains of Madness is different in that he's worked on it for so long. He first started work on it in 1993 before coming up with a script. Eventually, Del Toro found some powerful friends willing to back him on At the Mountains of Madness. James Cameron, who helped Del Toro save his father from a kidnapping, was willing to come on as a producer, and Tom Cruise, who collects talented directors like Pokemon, was willing to star. He took the project to Universal, who was willing to give him some money to open up an art room to come up with monster designs. For a while, things were going well, and production was even set to begin in May of 2011. But Del Toro is an auteur in the truest sense of the word. He has a distinctive style, and the movie he wanted to make was the one in his head. He said as much, saying in a New Yorker interview that, quote, I don't want to make a movie called At the Mountains of Madness, I want to make this movie, and if I cannot make this movie, I'll do something else, end quote. Universal and Del Toro clashed over Del Toro's insistence on the movie being rated R. That was a no-go for Universal, who wanted PG-13 max. In 2020, Del Toro tried shopping it to Netflix, though he decided to make some changes, saying he could do a, quote, far more esoteric, weirder, smaller version of it, end quote. Most recently, he mentioned that the movie could be stop motion, much like his Pinocchio movie. At this point, however, the movie does seem unlikely to ever happen. It's unfortunate. Del Toro reminds me of someone like Stanley Kubrick or Paul Thomas Anderson, the type of director you want to fund because of their interesting visions more than anything else. Del Toro has a friend, Hideo Kojima, who also really loves movies. It's not for nothing that the Metal Gear series has been praised so much and so often for their cinematic quality. Considering the numerous movies that influenced it, not least of all John Carpenter's Escape from New York, whose main character, Snake Plissken, also inspired Solid Snake, it's no wonder that people have been trying to get a Metal Gear movie made for decades. Now, video game adaptations have, until very recently, had a bad rep. But the success of The Last of Us on the TV side and the Super Mario Bros. Movie on the film side have changed all of that. Kojima first announced a Metal Gear movie back in 2006. Directors like Paul Thomas Anderson were considered to direct it, while actors like Viggo Mortensen and Hugh Jackman were considered to play Solid Snake, even though David Hayter, the English voice for Snake, passed on a film treatment for the movie. But by 2010, development was halted as Konami felt that if the movie did poorly, it could also hurt game sales. But just a couple of years later, Kojima said that Avi and Ari Arad, the former of whom founded Marvel Studios, the movie branch of Marvel, would help produce a Metal Gear movie. But even a decade later, all that happened was more shuffling. A new director was attached, a new screenwriter was attached, Oscar Isaac was attached to play the role of Snake, Oscar Isaac was detached from the role of Snake, etc. Considering Kojima's departure from Konami in 2015, any Metal Gear movie at this point would surely not benefit from his input, but it's unlikely that the movie sees the light of day anyways. But then, something as complex as Metal Gear is unlikely to work as a movie. It should have been conceived of as a show from the get-go. There's a surprisingly rich history of video game movie adaptations that get left in the lurch, but seemingly just as many do eventually get made. A Bioshock movie was in development as far back as 2008 with Gore Verbinski, who did the Pirates of the Caribbean movies, attached as a director. But budget concerns, and as was the case with At the Mountains of Madness, fears over making it an R-rated movie got it shut down. But as of 2022, Netflix was developing it with Francis Lawrence directing. The The man directed Constantine, so he gets a pass on all future films as far as I'm concerned. The Legend of Zelda has, in the past, been envisioned as an animated movie, a CGI movie, and a live-action movie. Nintendo's experience with the 1993 live-action Super Mario Bros. Movie made them, understandably, hesitant with their other most famous property. For a brief moment, they flirted with some weird idea of making an interactive Zelda film. Eiji Aonuma, who served as designer, director, and producer on numerous Zelda games, said in an interview, quote, "I think really what would be most important to us is to be able to play with the format of a movie, make it more interactive, like you're able to take your 3DS into the theater and that leads you into participating in it somehow. We wouldn't want to make it the same as any other movie. We want to somehow change what a movie is," end quote. This obviously never panned out, but after the recent success of the Super Mario Bros. Movie, Nintendo finally put a Legend of Zelda movie into active development, to be directed by Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes director Wes Ball, with Shigeru Miyamoto and Avi Arad serving as producers. This one does seem pretty likely to happen. A Mega Man movie was first announced in 2014 at 20th Century Fox, but after the acquisition by Disney, several projects were cancelled and Mega Man was one of them. Capcom and their joint production partner, Churnin Entertainment, then decided to take the project to Netflix, where it's been since 2021. However, the movie still seems to be in the early stages of development. A Minecraft movie was first announced in February of 2014 to be developed with Warner Bros., and Sean Levy, who directed 2021's Free Guy and 2024's Deadpool and Wolverine, was slated to direct at the time but left the project. He was replaced by Rob McElhenney, while Steve Carell was slated to star in it. The movie had a release date of 2019, but scheduling conflicts led to more delays. Most recently, Jared Hess has been attached to the project, and Jack Black and Jason Momoa are set to star. The movie has a release date of April 4th, 2025, so this one might actually be happening, but Hollywood is a fickle place and Warner Bros. Is even more fickle than most studios as of late, so until we see it, it remains up in the air. There's also a lot of DC properties that have been left in the lurch, particularly when it comes to their most famous character, Superman, who has had a number of cancelled projects. There was Superman 5, which was scrapped after the failure of Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. In the 2000s, there were two Superman scripts cycling around. The first was Batman vs. Superman: Asylum, written by Andrew Kevin Walker and to be directed by Wolfgang Peterson. The draft was thought to be too dark, so Walker was replaced by Akiva Goldsman, whose draft, oddly enough, was pretty dark in and of itself, featuring Batman and Superman at their lowest, the former grieving the deaths of Dick Grayson, Alfred, and Commissioner Gordon, and the latter divorced from Lois Lane. The other was Superman Flyby, also known as Superman Man of Steel. It was being written by J.J. Abrams and featured a neurotic Superman that has a hard time coming to terms with his powers. Brett Ratner, of Rush Hour fame, was hired to direct the movie, and actors like Matt Bomer, Josh Hartnett, Jude Law, Paul Walker, and Brendan Fraser were considered for the role. The terms were lucrative but stifling. Hartnett apparently was offered $100 million for a 3-picture deal, but Superman would have been his life for as long as a decade. Ratner would eventually drop out thanks to fighting with producer John Peters, to be replaced by McGee, who would later leave over budgetary concerns. I'm sure people were thinking that Superman was cursed at this point, which it might as well have been, because eventually a Superman movie did get made. 2006's Superman Returns, a commercial failure starring Brandon Routh. While the movie was reviewed well, its failure resulted in the cancellation of a planned sequel. Later on, a Man of Steel sequel didn't happen thanks to Man of Steel not meeting expectations. The DCEU was essentially a decade-long fiasco that ended with James Gunn and Peter Safran taking over, clearing out the old, and starting fresh. But lest we think that Superman was the only unlucky DC property, Batman also had a rough go of it. After a string of successes in the late 80s throughout the mid-90s, 1997's Batman and Robin set comic book movies back a few years. An unmitigated commercial and critical flop, it set Batman back by nearly a decade. Between it and Batman Begins, DC started and stopped several projects. One was the aforementioned Batman vs. Superman, but there were a few others. One was a Batman Beyond movie, written by Paul Dini, Neil Stephenson, and Boaz Yakin. At the same time, they pursued an adaptation of Frank Miller's Batman Year One to be directed by Darren Aronofsky. It would have been an R-rated Batman movie with more realistic violence. Aronofsky wanted Joaquin Phoenix, while the studio wanted Freddie Prinze Jr. as the Caped Crusader. The issue, apparently, was that Aronofsky wanted a very violent, very dark Batman. Frank Miller, who also did The Dark Knight Returns, said in an interview with The Hollywood Reporter that, quote, It was the first time I worked on a Batman project with somebody whose vision of Batman was darker than mine. My Batman was too nice for him. We would argue about it, and I'd say Batman wouldn't do that, he wouldn't torture anybody, and so on, end quote. Warner Brothers wasn't on board for that though, so the project was scrapped. For a moment there was also Justice League Mortal, which had Mad Max director George Miller on board, but after the success of The Dark Knight, it was decided to let Christopher Nolan finish his trilogy the way that he saw fit. Honestly, DC has so many unfinished projects that it'd be impossible to go through them all for this video essay, but it's something that I might do in the future. There are more than 3 dozen cancelled projects as part of the DCEU, and well over 100 over the last few decades. One common feature of all these movies though, is that they always get stuck in the early stages of development. Sure, talent gets attached and some money does get put into the project, but the real whoppers are the movies that have literal tens of millions, if not more than 100 million thrown at them, and never see the light of day. The wildest production hell story is not, in fact, the cancelled Batgirl movie, which we're going to get to in a moment. No, the absolute wildest is Empires of the Deep, which had a staggering $130 million poured into it over a course of nearly 2 decades. This is how Mitch Moxley, who's undoubtedly written the best piece on the movie for Atavist, described it, quote, Empires of the Deep would be China's Avatar, a reportedly $100 million production featuring mermaid sirens, Greek warriors, pirates, and sea monsters, complete with cutting-edge special effects and an international cast. The film's producers hoped that it would break through the cultural barrier that had frustrated producers on both sides of the Pacific for years. A Hollywood-style blockbuster made in China that would captivate audiences around the world, end quote. It was originally supposed to be released in May of 2011, but that, obviously, did not happen. The film had been the vanity project of Chinese real estate billionaire John Jiang, who wanted to make an epic. That's reasonable enough. The man's got the money, and epics make for fantastic films, and he got to work on hiring epic talent. Randall Frakes, a longtime collaborator of James Cameron, was brought on as a screenwriter, and Jiang tried to get Irvin Kershner, who directed Empire Strikes Back, on as the director. But immediately, people started clashing. Jiang had his own idea of what the movie should be, while Frakes had his. Kershner liked Frakes' idea, Jiang didn't, so the two left the project. By Jiang's admission, the movie went through 40 drafts over 4 years across 10 screenwriters. Unlike the previous projects, filming did begin in 2009 on Empires of the Deep, helmed by Jonathan Lawrence, who called it, quote, the worst fucking script I've ever read, end quote, though Jiang wouldn't let him change it either. The shoot was plagued with issues. Actors were paid late, stuntmen suffered frequent injuries, people quit the movie, and so on. Even Lawrence couldn't see it through to the end. He quit the movie 5 months into a ridiculously long shoot, and another director, Michael French, was brought in to finish. Well, that was the idea, at least, because French also quit and was replaced by Scott Miller, who ended up finishing the job. That did not matter though. The film was a jumbled mess and no one wanted to pick it up for distribution, which meant it had no way into theaters. The most people have seen, besides the behind-the-scenes shots, is a trailer that got poor reception. That doesn't exactly bode well for the movie, if it ever does get released, which at this point is unlikely. Batgirl is probably one of the most famous production hell stories in recent memory. Produced by DC for HBO Max, it was supposed to be part of the DCEU, but after a decade of struggling to find their footing, the DCEU was unceremoniously cut short and a new era began under James Gunn. The Batgirl movie, budgeted at $90 million, had a smoother early production than a lot of other movies. Joss Whedon began developing it in 2017, but left to be replaced by Bad Boys for Life director duo Adil El Arbi and Bilal Fallah. The movie starred Leslie Grace as Batgirl and was filmed between November 2021 and March 2022. Things were progressing smoothly, and the film even entered post-production. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Warner Brothers decided to scrap it in August 2022. There would be no streaming or theatrical release. In Hollywood at least, it was a cancellation without precedent, as usually, even movies that are doomed to fail, either critically or commercially, are released in the hopes that the movie can eventually recoup its budget. But Warner decided to scrap the movie and write it off as a tax loss. The directors were themselves blindsided by the cancellation, as was DC Films president Walter Hamada. Most of the issues stem from a change in strategy. The movie was being developed at a time where the focus was on streaming and getting people onto HBO Max. But upon the merger of Warner Brothers and Discovery and the ascent of David Zaslav as CEO, the company decided to refocus on theatrical releases. Alas, Batgirl was made for a smaller screen, which necessarily impacted its effects, quality, and the choices that went into making it. The final movie was at odds with the new direction of the company. While another incarnation of Batgirl will see the light of day in the new DCU, this incarnation will never see the light of day. But Batgirl isn't the only superhero movie that got tens of millions of dollars poured into it and was never released. There was also 1998 Superman Lives, which had $30 million poured into it. The first major theatrical Superman movie was Richard Donner's 1978 masterpiece, a critical and commercial success. The subsequent movies were less successful than the original, and by the 90s, Superman the Animated Series was the main Superman thing on air. But behind the scenes, inveterate comic book lover Kevin Smith was trying to get a Superman movie made. He discussed the project with John Peters, who had optioned the rights to do a Superman movie. Peters was on board, but he had a few requirements. 1. No flying and no blue and red suit. 2. Superman will be darker and meaner. 3. Superman should for some reason fight a giant spider in the third act, something that we did see in the Nick Cage Superman cameo in The Flash. 4. Brainiac should fight a polar bear at the Fortress of Solitude. And on and on. Smith's script would include Brainiac, Doomsday, and Lex Luthor, with Ben Affleck as Superman, Jack Nicholson as Lex Luthor, and Jason Lee as Brainiac, though none of these would work out. Smith would write the script, and after being turned down by director Robert Rodriguez, who had already committed to 1998's The Faculty, Smith turned to Tim Burton, who was offered $5 million. Everyone seemed to think that the movie was really happening. Warner even planned a release in the summer of 1998 to coincide with the 60th anniversary of Superman's first appearance in Action Comics #1 in April of 1938. Ben Affleck didn't work out, so they went to Nick Cage, who was offered a shocking $20 million for the role. Kevin Spacey was considered for Lex and Christopher Walken for Brainiac, but it would all be for naught. Smith and Burton clashed, which must have stung Smith, who was the one who originally suggested Burton as the director. Warner would, of course, back Tim Burton, who decided to bring on a new screenwriter, Wesley Strick. In Smith's words, quote, "The studio was happy with what I was doing. Then Tim Burton got involved, and when he signed his pay-or-play deal, he turned around and said that he would do his version of Superman. So, who is Warner Brothers going to back? The guy who made Clerks, or the guy who made them $500 million on Batman?" End quote. But with Strick came new issues, namely a budget that ballooned to $190 million, or roughly $370 million in 2024. Warner replaced Strick with Dan Gilroy, who got the budget down to $100 million. By April of 1998, around the time that the movie was supposed to come out, it hadn't even started shooting. $30 million in the hole, Warner Brothers decided to scrap the project. Of the ordeal, Tim Burton said, quote, "I basically wasted a year. A year is a long time to be working with somebody that you don't really want to be working with," end quote. Peters tried to shop it around to different directors, hoping to get it revived, but there were no takers. The most we would ever see of the movie is Nick Cage's Flash cameo, as well as the documentary, The Death of Superman Lives, What Happened. While some of the aforementioned might eventually see the light of day, such as The Legend of Zelda and Bioshock, most of them will probably never be seen. Their scripts might make their way to the internet and perhaps some concept art, but it'll usually end there. It's a shame, of course. When you have someone with the talent of Guillermo del Toro behind you, you should be willing to take a risk. At worst, you'll get a piece of movie history. Thankfully, there are also plenty of movies that get stuck but are eventually able to see the light of day. But that's for another video.